Okay, we're live on air. Late night here for me. Early evening for you, Alexander.
Well, fairly early, yes. But then I'm a night bird, so I'll be up many hours, but carefully reading all the things that go on in the world and following what the media in the US is saying. That it's morning there.
Yeah, it is. It's morning in the US.
Mm.
Yes, it is. So hopefully people are getting up and they're seeing this stream. We were going to do a video actually on this topic of the Erdogan in Moscow meeting with Putin again. I think this is the third meeting they've had this year.
Oh, they meet very often, but you're quite right. This is the third meeting, and bear in mind we're only into April. But Putin and Erdogan, since the two countries repaired their relations, which was in 2016, when Erdogan made a very important trip to Moscow. There was a previous period of about a year when relations between Russia and Turkey briefly got tense, when the Turkish Air Force shot down a Russian bomber operating, Su-24 bomber operating in Syria. But then there was the attempted coup against Erdogan. The Russians very publicly sided with Erdogan during and to an even greater extent after that coup. And Erdogan used that opportunity to amend fully fences with the Russians, having already indicated in the weeks before the coup, that was what he was intending to do anyway. Since then, Erdogan and Putin have been meeting on a very regular basis. And I think that Erdogan is probably the visitor that Putin hosts most regularly in Moscow and in Sochi, which is the Black Sea resort, where the Russian president has his summer residence and where Putin often meets with foreign leaders.
Yeah, that is very true. All right, we got some people on the chat as well. Let's see, Rusko Disco, Sonoma Takova, Nigel, gotta love those notifications. Okay, so you got the notification. That's good. Some people are saying they're not getting the notifications on a lot of our videos.
Yes.
And that is a shame.
Yes.
That is a big shame. There's also some people that are saying they're getting unsubscribed from our videos. That is also very uncool via YouTube's part.
Yes.
But Nigel is in London and he says, good evening from London. Let's see, Alexander for PM, for Prime Minister. We did a video, just one of the first videos we did before we got on this live was on May's trip to Brussels. So that'll be going out tomorrow. But we were going to do a video on Russia and Turkey. We said, let's just go live with it because we wanted to get the news out quickly to you guys as to what happened during Erdogan's meeting at the Kremlin. Good evening from Wales. Let's see. It's morning in Australia. All right, good morning. Let's see. Nigel says Alexander is looking good in the video. Very clear. All right. Alexander has a good feed. That's great. All right. Welcome, everybody, to a live chat on Erdogan in Moscow, meeting with Putin. Once again, of course, we have the S400 deal, Alexander, which so far it looks like Turkey is going to be moving forward with that S400 purchase. Mike Pompeo made some statements, some may call it warnings, to Turkey not to buy the S400, to opt out of that deal and to go ahead and purchase Patriot missiles and the Patriot system. Alexander, what is your take on the meeting between Erdogan and Putin? How is it looking for the United States, its relation with Turkey? How do you see things shaping up?
I think this is an extremely important meeting, and incidentally, this is one reason why we've decided to do a live, because with all the Brexit news and all the Russiagate news, it's easy to overlook this event. And in fact, it is actually a very important event, because Turkey has been a key member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization of NATO. It's been the United States' great ally in this area of the Middle East and in Europe, because of course Turkey is both in the Middle East and in Europe. It's both a Middle East country and a European country. It also provides the US's access to the Black Sea and it's also been the country through which the US has been able to keep an eye on what the Russians are doing in the Caucasus, and to interfere to some extent in the Caucasus, and to make life for the Russians difficult there. And last but not least, Turkey is a big country. It has a large population. It has the second biggest military in NATO. It is a major contributor historically to the NATO alliance, and it's been the US's firm ally. Now, what is now starting to happen, and many of us were skeptical that it ever would, but it's increasingly becoming clear that the direction, the momentum of events is pushing in one direction, which is that Turkey is now slowly moving away from the US. In fact, not so slowly, quite rapidly moving away from the US, is beginning to give up on its historic connections with NATO and with the European Union, is increasingly reconsidering itself as a Eurasian power, and is beginning to realign with China, and increasingly, obviously, with Russia. Now, of course, that's very important because Turkey and Russia have not always been particularly good friends. There was a time in the 1920s when Russia and Turkey were very close, when the Soviet Union and Kemal Atatürk, who was the leader of Turkey, were on very friendly terms. But generally, the more common relationship between Turkey and Russia has been a hostile one. The two countries have fought many wars with each other, and the Turks, until very recently, I remember traveling in Turkey and encountering this, conceived of Russia as an enemy. Now, what has happened, and it's not just President Erdogan who thinks this way, it is the large majority of the Turkish people also are now increasingly disillusioned with Turkey's alliance with the US, and they are increasingly warming to their relations with Russia, which is becoming Turkey's major economic partner. And what we have seen in this visit by President Erdogan to Moscow, and in his meeting with Russia's President Putin in the Kremlin, is that this relationship is now going beyond an economic relationship, which it had been until very recently. It is now increasingly developing a military dimension. So that President Erdogan is sticking with this purchase of these S400 missiles from Russia, always a controversial step as far as the US was concerned. But instead of using it as a bargaining chip, as many people, including possibly President Erdogan himself, had expected when the announcement was originally made, President Erdogan is now fully committed to this deal, and his prestige is tied up with it to the point that it's no longer, I think, a reversible one. So that deal is going ahead. He's talking about, in Moscow with Putin, buying more S-400 missiles from Russia than those which had originally been ordered. And most controversially of all, he's now speaking about buying advanced Russian military aircraft, fighter jets, Su-35 fighter jets, and even Su-57 fifth generation fighter jets, which are only just now starting to enter service with the Russian military from the Russians, in place of the military hardware Turkey used to import from the United States. So this is a momentous event, because with Turkey increasingly establishing economic and commercial relations with Russia, now that those are broadening to include military relations with Russia, and with Turkey increasingly disregarding warnings from the United States, including warnings it recently had from Vice President Pence, which is that it would have to choose either between the S-400 or with NATO, or NATO. It'd be either the S-400 or NATO. It seems that Turkey is now increasingly committing itself to this relationship with Russia, to this military, economic, and political relationship with Russia. And if this trend continues, and it looks as if it will, and if it accelerates, which it also looks as if it will, one has to ask how much longer Turkey can remain in NATO, and will it eventually realign fully and integrate itself with the various institutions created by the two great Eurasian powers, China and Russia, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and even possibly the Eurasian Economic Community, which the Russians lead. So we are looking at immensely important events. And this visit by President Erdogan to Turkey is, in my opinion, a crucial event in the development of not just of the Middle East, not just of Turkey, but of the entire geostrategic relationship and the balance of power between the great powers.
Yeah, the U.S. is not going to let Turkey go that easily. That's for sure.
No.
And Erdogan is extremely unpredictable. And while we see him moving towards Russia and China, towards Eurasia, Erdogan on the flip of a coin can just as easily go right back to the United States and right back to NATO. And there's a question from Simon Coates Alexander, which is, did Russia forgive Turkey for shooting down the Russian Su-24 in Syria? And I'm asking you this question because I think this is proof of the fact that things can change so quickly and so dramatically that just when you think that Turkey may be aligning with Russia and China, certain events could occur where the tables flip and Turkey is right back to where it was with NATO.
Absolutely. The answer to the question is that the Russians have forgiven it, but they have not forgotten it. In other words, they will work as closely as they can with President Erdogan, but I still think that they don't fully trust him, precisely for the reason that you said. I mean, Putin and Erdogan used to have a very close relationship. Then there was this crisis over the Su-24 plane, and relations became very bad. Then Erdogan apologized to the Russians for it, and he's since blamed the coup plotters who instigated the coup against him for the incident. I don't think anybody, by the way, believes that. And of course, it was in Russia's interest to mend fences and to accept that apology. And I think that the Russians are genuinely surprised by how far this rapprochement has gone. I think it has gone far beyond their expectations. But obviously, they recognize that Erdogan is someone who can change policy very radically. And as I said before, previously, the Russians have not forgotten that the more traditional policy of Turkey has been of hostility to Russia rather than friendship with it. And Russians who are historically minded, and many Russians are historically minded, and people in the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry especially are, of course, have not forgotten how the previous period of Russian-Turkish friendship under Kemal Atatürk eventually came to nothing. Having said that, I think there are some changes. Firstly, I think this has now become a policy that many people in Turkey support. So it's no longer just Erdogan himself. I think Erdogan, if he was to completely reverse it, might run into some opposition, including from sections of the Turkish business community that are now doing very well from the relationship, the commercial relationship with Russia. But the second thing is that President Erdogan is now so invested in this policy, and the US also now mistrusts him so much that he may calculate that he's gone so far that it's not really possible any longer for him to turn back. Maybe he will tilt back to the United States to some degree in future. But I think that a total reversal, a complete flip of this policy, at least whilst Erdogan remains president of Turkey, is unlikely.
All right, guys, just let's take care of some business. Hit that like button, guys. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed to it. Click that notification bell. Once again, we have a lot of people saying that they're not getting the notifications. So make sure you click that bell so you can get the notifications when we do lives like this or when we push out a new video. And of course, you can go to the Duran shop and you can pick up a t-shirt that really helps us out a lot. And it helps us broadcast to you guys. So it helps fund the channel. And we really, really appreciate everybody who's bought a shirt and everyone who's donated to us on PayPal or on Patreon. You guys help keep us going, and we really, really thank you a lot. Alexander, there's a couple of questions in the chat, which actually are questions that I wanted to ask you as well. One of the questions is from Liquid Zero, and it is, what about the U.S. Incirlik Air Base in Turkey? What about the Air Base in Incirlik? Is that still operating? If Turkey continues to move towards Russia and China, will the U.S. start to pull back on that airbase? What's going on there?
Well, the answer is it is still there, and the U.S. still has a big presence in Incirlik. And Incirlik is hugely important for the United States. I mean, it used to be one of the places from which U-2 flights used to happen to overfly the Soviet Union. And of course, it is one of the bases which is was used by the U.S. to conduct air operations in Syria. So Incirlik is hugely important, and the US is still there. But obviously, as the relationship between Turkey and the US deteriorates, so the US is becoming less confident about Incirlik. There are reports that it's pulled out the nuclear weapons that it used to store there. That shows you how close the relationship, by the way, between US and Turkey used to be, that the US actually had, apparently, nuclear weapons in Incirlik. Apparently, they've withdrawn them. If we ever see this complete realignment, which I think now, for the first time, I'm starting to think may be possible, then I don't see the US staying in Incirlik very long. And of course, if Turkey leaves NATO, then I can't see that happening at all.
That would be massive if they leave. Another question from Duran. Do you think that Erdogan is warming up because Russia warned him about the coup attempt? This is a good question. We talked about this right before we were about to go live. Duran, is what effect did the coup have on this on Turkey's new realignment with Russia and China? What do you think of that question, Alexander?
I think the coup is a hugely important event. Now, at the time of the coup, there was a report by the Fars news agency, which is Iranian, but it was based on Arabic and Iranian, and to some extent Turkish sources, that Russian intelligence in Syria picked up signals passing between the coup plotters, and that they passed them on to the Turkish General Staff. And it was this which enabled the Turkish General Staff to act so promptly to suppress the coup. Now, that has never been admitted and confirmed, and Erdogan himself has poured cold water on it. But of course, if it was true, it probably wouldn't be publicly confirmed anyway. What is beyond question is that Erdogan was absolutely shocked at how his Western allies seemed on balance to be pleased that the coup was taking place and that he was going to be overthrown. And bear in mind that Erdogan was the democratically elected leader of Turkey. So I think that particularly shocked him, that they would side with a military coup against him. And at the same time, he also detected the fact that the Russians were sympathetic to him, because, of course, the one thing the Russians dislike more than anything else is regime change. They want to see governments change in a constitutional way. And I think that played a key role in persuading President Erdogan to shift his policies. I mean, he'd already signaled before the coup that he wanted to mend his fences with the Russians. But I think this greatly accelerated it afterwards. Firstly, I think he purged from the Turkish military the very large number of pro-American generals and officers who have historically been entrenched in the military. And secondly, and I think very importantly from his point of view, he also realized as a result of the coup who his friends were and who his potential enemies were. The fact that he harps on the fact that Gulen, this Islamic cleric, was supposedly the mastermind of the coup. I think the way to understand that, by the way, is that Gulen is based in the United States and is widely believed by many people to be a CIA asset. And I think by harping on about Gulen, Erdogan is essentially pointing to the US as the people behind the coup. He's never actually stated it in so many terms, but I think that's probably what he believes, and certainly that's what he hints at.
I think Michigan is calling you, Alexander.
I think he's being very, very noisy.
Yeah, he is being noisy, and you attend to Michigan, and I'll keep the conversation moving while Alexander brings his dog in. And the question on Turkey and Greece, I'm going to get to that one because I'm curious about that one as well. So as we wait for Alexander, I'm going to look through the chat and see what other questions everyone's asking and where everyone is chiming in from. Let's see here. All right, Scotland, people from Scotland. Good to have you here. From Sweden, good to have you here as well.
Dogs are wonderful things, but they come with a bark.
Yeah,
apologies
they do come with a bark. No worries.
Apologies to our viewers if there was.
There's a lot of people. I'm reading the chat, Alexander. There's a lot of people asking about Turkey and Greece. If Turkey aligns with Russia and China, what does this mean for Turkish and Greek relations? This is a good question. It's a good question because obviously you have Greece and Turkey. They're both in NATO. There's always been historical tensions between Greece and Turkey. That's obvious, I think, to all our viewers. But Russia has excellent relations with Greece, both of the countries being majority Orthodox countries, and the Russians think very favorably of the Greeks, and the Greeks have an incredible and astronomical affection and approval rating for Russia and for Vladimir Putin. So what do you make of that question and those comments?
Yes, I mean, it's an excellent question. What I'm going to say is this. I think that for the Russians, any Turkish action against Greece would be a red line. I think that the Russians have very strong sentimental and emotional feelings to Greece. I say that as a Greek who's traveled in Russia and is surprised, actually, at how strong Russian feelings about Greece are. And Putin himself shares them. I mean, he's talked about this often. He's talked about, I mean, he's been to places like Athos. He clearly has a very, very genuine attachment for Greece. So if
he's been to Athos many times, and they actually Putin, and just on a side, Alexander, they actually let Putin sit on one of the throne chairs that I mean is literally reserved only for the patriarchs, and that was very symbolic because a lot of the people in Athos saw Putin as the person who's going to bring back the traditional, Byzantine, glory of old times.
Well,
so that was an interesting occurrence. Yeah,
absolutely. So as I said, I mean, there's very strong feelings on both sides, and I think that however close the relationship between Russia and Turkey becomes, and it is becoming extremely close, and at a personal level, and now lots of Russians go to Turkey for business and for their holidays, and they like it there, but I think the connection with Greece overrides it. So I think if there's any kind of situation where the Turks fall into conflict with Greece, I think the Russians will do everything they can, first of all, to diffuse it, because obviously they won't want to jeopardize their relationship with Turkey. So they will try to mediate any quarrel and to try and look for a settlement between the Greeks and the Turks. But I think in the end, if there is a real bust up between these two countries, which by the way I don't expect, I think that the Russians will tell the Turks this is a red line. At the end of the day, if you want to go there, if you want to really end have a major fight with Greece, that's not something we can support you with. That's something we're going to oppose you with. It's important to remember that the Russians told the Turks exactly the same thing about Syria. I mean, they made it very clear to the Turks right from the first moment when Erdogan started to patch up relations with Russia, that the Russians were not prepared to compromise their relations with Syria in order to benefit Turkey. And in the end, it was the Turks who had to accommodate themselves to what the Russians wanted, not the other way around. And I think that's the same would happen in any conflict situation between Turkey and Greece.
I have a really simple question for you, Alexander. Why does Turkey need the S-400s?
Yes,
practically speaking. I mean, they don't have any real threats.
No, it's an excellent question.
Warrant an S-400 system. So what's the real reasoning behind it?
It's an excellent question, because you're perfectly correct. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine any country attacking Turkey with an air force. So these S-400s are going to be purely decorative in a sense. I mean, they're going to be there, but it's difficult to imagine a situation where Turkey would use them. So why does Turkey want them? I think the reason it wanted them, I think the reason Erdogan originally decided to order them was that directly after the coup, he wanted to assert Turkey's independence of the US, which, as I said, I think in his own mind, he blamed for the coup, and to signal to the US how angry he was with the US over the coup. And at the same time, he wanted to make this gesture to the Russians. I think that at the beginning, it was to some extent with Erdogan a bargaining ploy. What I don't think he anticipated was that the US reaction would be so strong. And I think that has made him dig in on this, and now makes it very, very difficult for him to back off. By the way, I should explain that from the other side of the story, the Russian side, there are an awful lot of people in Russia who were very skeptical about selling to Turkey the S-400s. They said this is an advanced technology. If we sell it to Turkey, which is a NATO state, how can we be sure that this technology will not be passed on to the Americans and won't be compromised? And it was Putin's personal decision that eventually decided the question and settled it, and meant that the Russians would proceed with the sale. And I think that just as Erdogan was probably surprised by the strength of the American reaction, I think so have the Russians been. And I think the Russians never, in their wildest dreams, expected that the sale of the S-400s to Turkey would work as well for them as it has done, and would create so many divisions between the US and Turkey. I think, frankly, the US has mishandled this thing.
Well, the US had the same argument from the flip side with the F-35. They said, we're not going to give you any more equipment for the F-35 because you're going to be getting the S-400s, and you're going to use that system to compromise the F-35. So, yes. I mean, you had the same rhetoric coming from the US side. Yes,
except, of course, that in the US, the rhetoric prevailed, and in Russia, it didn't. And that's very remarkable when you think about it, because, of course, Turkey is a NATO state, theoretically aligned to the United States. So you'd have thought that the US would be, they would be the other way exactly, that the US would trust Turkey. I think the fact that it showed so openly that it didn't has incensed the Turks greatly, and has been one of the major factors in tilting them even further to the Russians than perhaps they'd intended to go.
All right, here's a question from Darren Alexander. Would Erdogan ever in 10 years try to establish a Neo-Ottoman empire, a new Ottoman empire?
Well, he talks about
he talks about it all the time.
All the time, and some of the things he says are extraordinary. I mean, he talks about this in the most megalomaniac way, if I have to be frank. And he doesn't just talk about it. I mean, he's done things. He was a major sponsor. Let us never forget our various jihadi groups in Syria. And he's occupying with his military areas of Syria as we speak, and of course he's spoken of Syria in the past as essentially a part of Turkey's sphere of influence, and he's talked about some of the Kurdish areas in Iraq in similar terms. So I think Erdogan himself hankers definitely for a much bigger geopolitical role for Turkey than any other Turkish leader has done since the time of the Ottomans, and would love to be able to, you know, propel Turkey to that position of importance. So I think, you know, I think that he does believe in this policy, and that he hasn't given up on it. But I think what he's found is that by trying to pursue that sort of policy, he's made many enemies in the region. He's upset the US, which was the traditional hegemon, the traditional dominant power in that region. And as a result, that has forced him into greater dependence on the Russians and the Chinese, which, for all sorts of other reasons, I think he finds personally attractive anyway. But certainly Neo-Ottomanism is an important factor in his thinking. And going back to something that Alex Christoforou said earlier in our program, if he thinks he can pursue it, and that the Russians stand in his way to doing so, it's the sort of thing that might make him flip.
Yeah, and I think Erdogan subscribes to a negotiating tactic, which is he'll push everything to the maximum level.
Yeah.
And you know, eventually he'll say, if I ask for everything and go completely extreme, I'm going to get something in the deal.
Yeah.
And that's why he makes claims, you know, on the Greek islands, for example,
yes.
or he's doing what he's doing in Syria or elsewhere. And sometimes he makes these outrageous claims, because I think he knows that if I push it far enough, I may not get what I'm asking for, but you know, if I ask for 10 steps, I'm going to get at least 1 or 2. And
Exactly.
I think that's a big part of his negotiating
Absolutely,
tactic.
Absolutely. It is very much his negotiating style. The Russians understand it, by the way. I mean, the Russians have spent an enormous amount of time negotiating with Erdogan. I think they figured him out completely. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why they've been so successful working with him. The Americans never have. They've never understood his style. And that's one reason why relations between them and Erdogan have become so bad. The Americans don't like being presented with demands in the way that Erdogan routinely makes demands. And I think that that's made them angry.
What's Turkey's position right now with the European Union, Alexander? Where is that at?
That's a very good question, because, of course, Turkey has been trying to join the European Union ever since the 1963, I think it began the process. I think the Turks have basically given up hope that they're ever going to join. I mean, if you look at most of
lucky them.
Well, lucky them indeed. If you look at most of the governments of Central Europe now, I mean, they're committed to blocking Turkey from joining. And I think the Turks follow this very closely, and even those Turks who are pro-EU, and there are still some, you know, who are pro-Western, I think they've come to realize that this is a door that they're going to keep banging on indefinitely, but which will never open. And that, I think, has meant that though Turkish official policy is still to join the EU one day, in practice, Erdogan is clearly no longer seeking it. He doesn't get on at all well with most of the EU governments. He doesn't get on well with Merkel. He doesn't get on well with Macron. In fact, he makes it quite clear that he dislikes them both. And I think in consequence of all of that, I'm sorry, that's my phone. I think in consequence of all of that, he's probably going to. That's one of the major drivers in the fact that he's realigning in the way that he is.
I think Erdogan's on the line.
Yeah, probably. He's going to explain.
He's taking issue with some of your analysis.
Probably. Well, actually, I'm confident with in my analysis. I'm pretty sure that he thinks what he says, that he's thinking in the way that I said.
Did you just put that phone in your drawer?
Absolutely. Why not? Okay. So, as I said, I think that Turkey is actually drifting away from the EU. I think that the EU slamming the door on Turkey repeatedly in the way that it's doing is one of the major factors in explaining why this realignment on the part of Turkey is taking place, and why Erdogan himself is now obtaining support within Turkey in pursuing it.
I'm looking at the chat right now. One guy's like, Erdogan won't go away. Yeah, he keeps on trying to call you, Alexander.
He certainly
Erdogan
is.
calling Alex as a Gulen supporter.
Indeed, he is.
Alexander, let's talk a little bit about Nord Stream, and we'll go to super chats afterwards and wrap this up.
Yes.
One of the major parts of Turkey is, at least one of the major parts for Turkey that entices Russia is, of course, the gas pipeline. So we got Nord Stream. I said Nord Stream. We got Nord Stream up top. We got Turk Stream. What was called, I believe, like 3-4 years ago, South Stream. I don't know if they call it.
It was
that
redirected.
Anymore.
It was going to go to Bulgaria, and then when the Bulgarians did all sorts of things which the European Union wanted them to do, the Russians redirected it to Turkey. So now it's called Turk Stream.
So now it's
going to become exactly. But then it's going to reconnect with all the pipelines. So it's going to be in effect replace South Stream.
South Stream 2.0.
Yeah, exactly.
So take us through what's happening with Turkey as a potential energy hub.
This is absolutely crucial, because again, this is where Erdogan is a cunning strategist, because of course he repaired his relations with the Russians, and he saw that South Stream wasn't going to happen. And Turkey is a country which is energy deficient anyway, so it needs energy and it imports gas from Russia. So he said to himself, well, this is my great chance. The Russians want to build pipelines. I'm going to offer them a pipeline, and I'm going to make Turkey into this great energy hub. And that's exactly what he's done. And this, of course, consolidates the economic relationship that exists between Turkey and Russia, and makes it much stronger. And it also enables Turkey to start influencing energy policy in the Balkans, which is, of course, an area which Turkey has historically always been interested and involved in. And from the Russian point of view, it provides not only another very strong economic link to Turkey, which is thereby bound more closely to Russia, but it also provides the Russians with yet another route, diversifying away from Ukraine, the country that they've always had this difficult relationship with, and which they don't trust as a transit state. So now they have Nord Stream going to Germany, and they've got South Stream going to Turkey.
Yeah, and that's a very strong bond. Once you put the pipeline down there, that's extremely difficult to break that bond. Well, and I think NATO and the US realize that very well.
It's all but impossible, because literally, realistically, you're not going to switch your gas off. You're not going to do that. If the gas flows, people make money from it, and it becomes crucial to the development of your economy. So both the Turks and the Germans want it, and they're going to resist any attempt by the United States or anyone else to stop them having it.
All right, let's take a couple of questions from the chat, and we'll move over to the super chats, and we'll wrap it up. Let's see. From AP, why is Russia and Greece acting so cold to each other? Are they still allies or pretending?
Yeah. Right.
We discussed this a little bit, but Russia and Greece, they're allies, and they will always, I think, they will always remain allies.
Yes.
Before you chime in, I will say one thing that I know from sources in Greece, Alexander. We've talked about this before. Putin was not very impressed with Tsipras.
No, he wasn't.
I mean,
no, he wasn't.
He was like, "Who is this joker?"
Yes.
I mean, he was not impressed with
you took it from me. I mean, the Russians have this very, very strong attachment to Greece. The Greeks have this very, very strong attachment to Russia. That's not going to change. The Russians have no time for Tsipras at all. I remember this so well from 2015, when Tsipras first became prime minister, and he spoke grandly of standing up to the EU over the bailouts. And he obviously said to the Russians, that he was going to do all kinds of deals with the Russians. And he attended the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in 2015. And Putin met him, and the Russians met him, and they very, very quickly sized him up. And they realized not just that this man was talking hot air, but that he was actually playing them off against the Europeans. In other words, he was creating a Russian scarecrow to frighten the Europeans into making concessions, but that he had no real intention of actually doing what Erdogan is now doing, which is realigning with the Russians, but that in fact it was simply a ploy to get the Europeans on side. The Russians were very angry about that. They felt that they were being used, and they have never trusted Tsipras at any time since then. And recently, and I'm sure this is what our viewer is referring to, of course, Tsipras backed the Macedonian name change, which tried to pass off opposition to it in Greece, which is very strong, as being somehow orchestrated by the Russians. So he again played this bizarre game, which we've seen so many people play in the United States, first and foremost, that the Russians are at the root of all our problems. And of course, the Russians weren't happy with that either. And Tsipras, to emphasize the point, even expelled some Russian diplomats, which made the Russians very angry. But we must always make the distinction between Tsipras, who, as I said, the Russians have never had much time for, and Greece, which the Russians have great sympathy and liking for. The Russians are fully capable of seeing beyond Tsipras, and they calculate anyway, as nearly everyone does, that he's not going to be prime minister of Greece for much longer.
Yeah, and also I want all our viewers to take note of the fact that the ambassador to Athens right now is one Jeffrey Pyatt. And if that name sounds familiar to everybody, it was Pyatt that helped orchestrate the coup in the Maidan in Ukraine. And for the good work he did in Ukraine, they gave him the job of ambassador of the United States to Greece. So a lot of the anti-Russian sentiment and a lot of the anti-Russian lobbying that you see in Greece right now, I am very, very certain, Alexander, falls at the feet of Jeffrey Pyatt.
I have no doubt that you're right. I'm sure you are.
All right, from Mustache of Wilhelm, why doesn't the U.S. deliver, Gulen? Why don't they just give him up?
Well, if he's a CIA asset, they don't want to give him up. Also, probably, Gulen still has influence in Turkey. I mean, we come back to the point that Alex Christoforou made earlier in the program. The United States is going to fight to hold on to Turkey. I mean, Erdogan is pursuing this policy at the moment. Erdogan has a lot of popular support, but Erdogan also has an awful lot of opposition in Turkey. His party lost the local elections in Ankara. It's disputed, but he probably lost the vote in Istanbul also. And though by no means all of the people who voted against Erdogan's party in Ankara and Istanbul are pro-US, the United States will want to, mobilize such opposition to Turkey as it can. Gulen has a very well organized network in Turkey. It's still there. I mean, it's not been completely broken up, despite all the steps that Erdogan has taken. And the United States will not want to give up what it, I'm sure, still considers a valuable asset.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get to some super chats, Alexander. From Risco Disco, Alexander is far too professional for this mic. I don't know. Actually, you got a really good mic now, and
Yes.
and your voice is very crisp now. So
Yeah.
we've made some upgrades, so that's good.
Yeah.
Let's see, Risco Disco again. Super chat. Our Russian culture is largely made up from Greece.
Well, a Russian academic once said to me that just as the Western Europe took its culture from Renaissance Italy, Russia took its culture from Byzantine Greece. So that Greece, for Russians, culturally speaking, is as important as Italy is for, say, Britain or France. I find that a most interesting comment, actually. One mustn't, of course, overlook the fact that Russian culture has evolved tremendously, but certainly there are certain shared roots there. And if any of our viewers have ever watched the very famous Russian film Andrei Rublev, which is about an icon painter in 13th century Russia, who many Russians consider to be their greatest icon painter. His teacher is a man called Theophanes, who is, of course, a Greek. So it's Theophanes the Greek. So that is right at the beginning of Russia's cultural history, when Russia first became a Christian Orthodox country. The Greeks were there. They were designing churches. They were organizing many things in Russia. And obviously, that cultural connection remains very strong.
All right. Erdogan on the phone again.
Again.
All right. Let's see a super chat from S. Zariel. From No More News today, there was a prediction of a small nuclear strike. Putin suspected to be part of this grand plan. Could this be true?
Well, I doubt it. I haven't heard any news about it. I mean, obviously, if we do hear any news about it, we will let our viewers know. But I'm sure that is a story. There are lots and lots of stories that circulate all the time. But if anybody was using nuclear weapons, we would certainly be hearing about it.
And there's a lot of fake stories circulating about Putin, that's for sure. From Penguins fan, a super chat, not on the topic of Turkey and Russia, but let's take it. U.S. frees Venezuela bank accounts for diplomats. Mike Pence telling Venezuela UN envoy to leave. What do you guys think about that? You talked about Mike Pence and Turkey, so this actually is a pretty relevant question. Why not? What do you think about the freezing of Venezuelan bank accounts?
Well, first of all, I am pretty sure, I'm absolutely sure that it violates the Vienna Convention on the immunity of diplomats. So here again, we are seeing the United States acting contrary to international law in pursuit of its regime change objectives. Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, and John Bolton are the three horsemen of the three horsemen. We're still waiting for the fourth of the apocalypse. They are absolutely the people who are driving these things. They are completely reckless in what they do. It doesn't surprise me in the least. Pence was the person who gave Turks this ultimatum, either the S400 or NATO. And here we see the same outlook and the same mentality being used against Venezuela and its diplomats. Doesn't surprise me in the slightest. Won't make any difference to the situation in Venezuela itself.
Yeah, Pence is a neocon. I think there's no doubt about that. He may not brand himself as that, but I think he is a neocon.
Well, in fact, he not just is. I mean, he is to an extreme degree. And it's interesting also and worrying what a very prominent role he's now playing in the country, in U.S. foreign policy.
That's a good point. Recently, Pence has kind of stepped forward from the shadows of Trump.
Absolutely.
I think that's becoming very obvious.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, from Penguins fan, a super chat update on Syria and Idlib. What is Erdogan's next move there?
That's very
will Erdogan hit the SDF?
Yes, well, this is a very, very good question, because in fact, Putin and Erdogan talked about Idlib, and Putin discussed it extensively in the press conference that followed the talks. And Putin said that the Turks and the Russians are now working hard on setting up coordinating committees, and in fact that they will be undertaking joint patrols together in Idlib province. Of course, the presence of joint patrols will mean that the Russian military will be entering Idlib with Turkey's agreement. And of course, where the Russians go, the Syrians will eventually follow. So I think this is a big step towards the eventual re-establishment of Syrian government control in Idlib. But as I said, it's been done one step at a time, as it always is between the Russians and the Turks. And Putin confirmed that it was that the negotiations with Turkey on this subject were extremely difficult. I don't think anybody's been surprised about that. So, but you know, they're difficult, but the Russians are persisting in them, and we're moving, I think, towards a definite outcome. Now, with the Turks attacking, well, let's call them by what they are, the Kurds, because of course the SDF is this umbrella term that's really used to conceal the fact that we're talking about the Kurdish militia. Will the Turks attack the Kurds? It's possible. It's entirely possible. I think they will be reluctant to do that whilst the US is still there, and that may be one reason why the US is still there. But it's possible they might attack the Kurds, and we were discussing the question of why do the Turks want the S400 missiles. Well, I suppose one possibility might be that they want the S400 missiles to defend themselves from the US Air Force if they attack the Kurds. it's a thought. It's a thought. I have to say, yeah, I have to say that is a very wild thought, and I don't think it will come to that. I personally still believe that eventually we're going to see a diplomatic solution whereby the Russians broker a deal between the Syrians and the Kurds and the Turks, whereby these Kurdish areas of Syria return to Syrian control, and at that point, the Turks will be able to back off.
Alexander, I've got a question here.
Yeah.
Why are the S400s so coveted? Why are they so damn good? And how come the United States, how come China, how come India, how come no one can replicate what they do?
Right. Well,
I mean, everyone is talking about the S400s, the S500s, the S300s. You know, 5 years ago, no one talked about them, but now they are in the news literally every single day. Why is that?
Well, the reason is that the Russians are massively experienced in this technology. I mean, the Russians were the first people to launch a major program to develop a surface-to-air missiles. That's the S-2025 program of the early 1950s, which was run by a brilliant engineer, tragically unknown outside Russia, called Raspelsin. That was, for people to know, that was the Russian Manhattan program in a sense. It was an absolute breakthrough in technological terms that they developed the S-25 surface-to-air missile system, and they have steadily since then developed and enhanced this technology. Now, the other thing that happened was that in the 1980s, there was this great fork in the road. The United States, which had always emphasized its military aircraft, decided to go very hard for developing stealth to protect its military aircraft. The Russians, who were fully aware of what the US was doing with stealth, went in the other direction. They decided that they would emphasize and develop to the greatest possible degree surface-to-air missiles and the associated radar and detection systems to counter those stealth systems. So the result was that the US ended up with the world's first stealth aircraft, and the Russians ended up with the world's most advanced surface-to-air missile systems. And I would add the S400 is, by universal acknowledgement, the most sophisticated surface-to-air missile system around at the moment. But there is an even more advanced one coming, which is the S500, which is going to be apparently much more potent even than the S400 is.
And how come the US can't replicate it?
Well, because they've never invested to anything like the same degree in the same technology. And it's not surprising, because with the largest air force in the world, the United States doesn't really feel that it is threatened by air attack in the same way that Russia is. The Russians have always emphasized ground radars and surface-to-air missiles to counter US aerial superiority, whereas the US has never felt the same need. That may change with the Russian Air Force now becoming more powerful, but that is the situation we have at the moment.
All right. And Nigel is saying some great stuff in the chat. He knows about the S400s, S300s as well. Great comments.
Sure.
Nigel, Alexander,
Yep.
read those comments when
I certainly will.
When we're out of this live stream. Let's
I
go to some more.
With pleasure.
Let's go to some more super chats here from Penguins fan. The U.S. designated the IRGC as a terrorist group. What will happen in Syria about this? We actually did a video on the IRGC today. It'll go up as well. But Alexander, what do you think of that?
I'll summarize it very quickly. I mean, first of all, it's a disastrous decision. It's an extremely bad decision, because the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is part of the Iranian armed forces. And to my mind, it sets the scene for military attacks by the United States and its allies on Iranian military, both in Syria and in Iraq, where the Iranian Revolutionary Guards are also based, but ultimately on Iran also. So I see it as a further step towards war, a war which some people in Israel and the United States want to wage against Iran. I think it's a very ominous and disturbing development. We've discussed it thoroughly in our video.
Yeah, and we'll get that video up very, very soon. From Dominique, super chat. These discussions are great. I'm a 70-year-old Vietnam vet with an HS education. The information I get from you has changed my understanding of the world. Thank you very much, Dominique. We really, really appreciate that super chat. And from Happy Zora, we got a $10 super chat. No comment. Thank you for that super chat, Happy Zora. And from Alexander Orlov. Did Putin's backing of Erdogan during the 2016 coup change anything on how common Turks perceive Russia? How did the common Turks see Russia?
Yeah, I think it probably did, in the sense that, of course, Erdogan's supporters will have appreciated the fact that Russia supported Erdogan during the coup. But I'm going to say something. I mean, I went to Turkey. I remember going to Turkey in the 80s. And of course, at that time, people in Turkey, ordinary people, were very anti-Russian, because that was the general attitude the Turks had towards Russia. Turkey had fought many wars with Russia and had lost most of them. And that was in itself a major cause of grievance. I mean, Crimea, which we now think of as, Russian, and which is disputed between Russia and Ukraine, used to be Turkish. And a lot of people in Turkey still seem to remember that. Now, when you go to Turkey, you find this attitude has changed completely. And it's one of the biggest changes, in my experience, that has happened in the attitude of one nation towards another. Probably because so many Russians travel to Turkey and have their holidays there. So Turkish people now see Russians. Of course, an awful lot of Turks go to Russia too. So there has been a radical shift in popular attitudes amongst Turkish people generally towards Russia. And I would add that it's not just Erdogan supporters who feel this way. it's an awful lot of people who are opposed to Erdogan also. It's one of the great shifts in opinion, public opinion, that I've seen in any country.
All right, a super chat from Legion Trooper. How long will Bolton last? No 4XL shirts. We're looking at the 4XL shirts for our shop, and hopefully we'll get those in stock soon. How long will Bolton last, Alexander? Hopefully he'll be out tomorrow.
Well, indeed, the only person who can answer that question is Donald Trump. I hope soon, before he does any more damage. At the moment, I must say, he looks firmly in the saddle and in control. And we see that in all the damage he's doing. All
right. From IR Spiderman, how would a war with Iran play out? We talked about this in the video we'll get up at Alexander. This is a great question because it's looming. It's there.
It is looming. First of all, I think that even the most extreme neocon and anti-Iran fanatic in Washington and Israel does not plan on sending an invasion force into Iran. This is a huge country. It's a populous country. It has a very strong military tradition, and it's also very mountainous. It's difficult to invade. I think there would be massive, massive opposition, and an invasion force would encounter immense problems. So I don't think that's the option people are looking at. What I think could happen, though, it would be a sustained bombing campaign as part of a project to try and achieve regime change.
You mean something along the lines of what happened with Serbia?
Yeah, indeed, absolutely, and all kinds of pressures exerted on Iran in that way. I predict that if that does happen, the Iranians will activate the various intelligence organizations that they've established in countries like Syria, in Iraq, and of course, above all, in Lebanon. And the danger would be that would also grow. And the other thing I suspect would happen is we would see clashes in the Persian Gulf, with the United States trying to blockade Iran. I think the Russians, who would be horrified by this development, and the Chinese would act, certainly the Russians would, to try to break that blockade by sending supplies into Iran from the north. So we would be looking at a major escalation. It would be a conflict on a scale that we have not seen in the Middle East up to now.
When you said that Iran would activate, certain sleeper cells and forces in Syria and in Iraq, you mean that their strategy would be to move the war outside of Iran's borders?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is exactly what it is. I mean, Iran suffered terribly during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, precisely because it was fought largely on Iranian territory. And I think what they have tried to do, and one of the things that has been driving their policy, is that they've tried to create a defense in depth. So they've tried to develop this network of alliances with countries like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. I think, and have always thought, that this is essentially a defensive alliance. I don't think the Iranians have any plan to attack Israel. I think they know perfectly well that they would be outmatched militarily in any such attack. So I think it's a defensive alliance. But if Iran itself was attacked, I think that that alliance would come into play, and we would see certainly Hezbollah rocket attacks on Israel, for example, with the Israeli army probably having to respond to them. And we would probably see action in Syria too.
All right, let's get to the couple of super chats, the last ones, and we'll wrap up this live stream. From Penguins fan, did FSB tip Erdogan's security during the coup?
Well,
we discussed that. Do you think FSB tipped them off?
Discussed that. I'm sure it wasn't, by the way, the FSB. The FSB, to be absolutely clear about this, is a counter-espionage organization. It carries out counter-espionage within Russia, and also to some extent, obviously, outside Russia. But it is not an intelligence agency in the same way that the old KGB was. The nearest equivalent to the FSB in the United States is the FBI, So I hope that explains what the FSB is. Russia's two foreign intelligence agencies are the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, and the SVR, which is its civilian intelligence agency. And Russia also has a very highly developed equivalent to the NSA, which is run by the FSO. It is called the FSO. So those are the three intelligence agencies that we are looking at. We're talking about the intelligence agency that is supposed to have tipped off the Turkish general staff. And let me stress, it's only supposed to, it's never been confirmed, is supposed to have been signals interceptions forces based in Syria, which points to it being the GRU. In other words, Russian military intelligence, not the FSB, not the SVR. But, you know, we don't know the whole story about that, and probably we never will.
Okay, interesting. Very interesting. From Nigel, a super chat. There is no new arms race because it's over before NATO even knew it was on. The technology of Russian armed forces is years ahead of any others.
Well, I hope so. I'm sure you're right, but that's a very big question. Maybe I think we are planning to do a video soon on the Russian aircraft industry, and which will touch on many of these technological questions. Because actually, the point Nigel makes is right, which is that in some ways, the economic catastrophe that Russia overwhelmed Russia in the 1990s, and the fact that there was essentially no military procurement at all in Russia for, you know, almost 2 decades, meant that the Russians were in a position to start from an almost clean slate. And of course, they have brilliant scientists and a very large military, industrial, technological complex once that was put together and reactivated. So the result is that they are producing now some very advanced weapons indeed, and also some very, very advanced civilian products, including in their aerospace industry.
All right, thank you for the super chat, Nigel. And from Penguins fan, this will be our last super chat, and we'll wrap it up. Does Iran have a proxy in Afghanistan?
Oh, yes. I mean, Iran is very heavily involved in Afghanistan, too. I mean, if one hears about these people in Afghanistan who are called the Tajiks speak a Persian language that very close to Old Persian. And there's long been a very strong connection between Afghanistan and Iran. And Kandahar, which is this southern Afghan city, you know, for much of its history, was actually a city that was part of the Persian Empire. So the Iranians have long had connections with Afghanistan. They know it very well. Of course, there is a religious difference. I mean, most, though not all, Afghans, but the great majority are Sunni, and Iran itself is a Shia country. But certainly, Iran has connections to Afghanistan and will continue to do so. There was a period when the Taliban was in power, when the Iranians were, of course, came very close to a war with the Taliban, partly in order to protect their Shia co-religionists in Afghanistan, and the Taliban backed off. So we can be certain that the Iranians are there. They have a very highly developed intelligence system operation, and they will certainly be present in Afghanistan too.
All right. One last super chat from Penguins fan. Where are Russian economy right now? Will the EU sanctions lift anytime soon?
Okay.
Where is it ranked?
Okay. We've had
this is a big topic.
It's a big topic. I'll give you some quick economic news. Firstly, inflation turned out much lower than anybody expected. We've now had, despite the VAT increase, we've now had in Russia 2 weeks of zero inflation. So this was completely unexpected by the central bank and by everybody else. And industrial production in Russia in I think March went up by 4.1%, with the core industries being even higher. So we have actually a much stronger economic performance this year than anybody had anticipated, because there were several tax changes, and the assumption was that would depress economic activity. It hasn't done so to the extent that anybody expected. And as for the sanctions, there's a very interesting article in Business New Europe, which is we don't really link to it because it's a publication behind a website, a paywall. But Business New Europe pointed out that not only has Russia now amassed this massive financial reserve, so that Russia now, that the Russian government has in its reserves more than the country owes in its entire foreign debt, both state and private. But it is in effect, because of this vast reserve that it has, and because of its self-sufficiency in energy and food, it has become essentially sanctions proof. And that, I think, is the view that most people looking at the situation in Russia would agree. So a strengthening economy and a sanctions proof one. Russia has come through the challenge it was faced with in 2014, when it faced the twin attack of the sanctions and a collapsing oil price. It has successfully adjusted to both.
Yeah, the sanctions made Russia sanction proof.
Indeed.
How about that?
Indeed.
All right,
Indeed.
guys, let's wrap it up there. Alexander, great live stream on Turkey and Russia and the meeting between Putin and Erdogan. Guys, thank you for joining us. Smash that like button. Share the channel with everybody you know. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel and click that notifications bell. Duran t-shirt, drnshop.com. Please buy a shirt. It really helps us out. And you can donate to us on PayPal and on Patreon as well. The links are in the description box down below. Alexander Mercouris, the Oracle of London. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for your super chats. And thank you for tuning in to us tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon, wherever you are. All right. Take care, everybody.